Tsongkhapa says in his praise of dependent origination, verse 38, that all you have taught proceeds by way of dependent origination. That too is done for the sake of nirvana. You have no deeds that do not bring peace. I put that in the chat for you. So in this verse, Tsongkhapa is saying that all the dharmas that were taught by the Buddha were for the sake of achieving the victorious state of omniscience. And it proceeding by way of dependent origination, meaning that the Buddha Shakyamuni himself taught everything through having generated a special insight that is a wisdom directly realizing selflessness or dependent origination. Essentially, that all phenomena do not exist from their own side at all, even from a single atom. So, having thus realized emptiness through this special insight, that is done for the sake of nirvana, right? All that you have taught is done for the sake of nirvana. So, having engendered this realization in others, one either culminates in the state of an arhat if one is a hero or solitary realizer on that path, or this realization of emptiness culminates in Buddhahood if one is a Mahayana Bodhisattva practitioner. So you have no deeds that do not bring peace, and all was done for nirvana also means that the Buddha didn't teach any dharma that was for the accomplishment of any worldly goal, but all was solely for the sake of nirvana, the ultimate goal. So for the next few sessions, we're going to be looking at a new topic, which is the Heart Sutra. It is essentially a summary of all 84,000 heaps of dharma that the Buddha taught. And for that reason, it's incredibly important and incredibly precious. But before we dive into that, it requires some context. So after the Buddha became fully enlightened, and also we can say from his first generation of bodhicitta before he eventually became enlightened, he did so entirely for the sake of all sentient beings, right? His only concern was thus for others, for other sentient beings, and thus what he taught too was entirely for their sake. And the audience for his very, very extensive set of teachings were a diverse set of beings of different inclinations and different beliefs. So those disciples can be generally divided into two types, those who pursue the Hinayana path and those who pursue the Mahayana path, or the lesser and greater vehicles. So with respect to his Hinayana disciples, that includes those on the paths of the Hira and the solitary realizer goals. So to them, he taught the basis, path, and fruits that correspond to such people. So the basis being the Four Noble Truths, essentially, the paths of that, and the result of their relevant arhatship. So the main teaching to such disciples is, as just said, the Four Noble Truths. And the initial teaching of the Four Noble Truths given was to the famous group of 5 disciples. So those were the main intended disciples of that first teaching. Of course, there were many more in the audience, such as gods, nagas, and so on and so forth. But those first 5 are asserted as the intended disciples of the teachings. So that's a summary of the teachings for the Hinayana disciples. So after the Buddha became enlightened, of course, he went to many different places teaching these 84,000 heaps of Dharma. But his teachings are often presented in an overview of the 3 turnings of the wheels. And the 3 turnings of the wheels are usually presented in terms of the first wheel, which was taught at Varanasi of the Four Noble Truths, the second turning of the wheel, which was the wheel of characteristiclessness, taught at Rajgriha, and the third is it Vaishali, where the third was taught? Looking at you, Jamie, but doesn't matter. You can easily look it up. The third, final wheel of Dharma.
Mm-hmm.
So that's one categorization of the three turnings of the wheel. Other ways of categorizing his teachings are those which were given at the beginning of his, let's say, beginning part of his life, then the middle part of his life, and the later part of his life. So famously, his second turning of the wheel, which is known as the Wheel of Characteristiclessness, was taught on Vulture's Peak near Rajgriha. And this was essentially or primarily a teaching of the basis, paths, and fruits of Mahayana practitioners. So one issue that comes up in the timeline is how long was the interval between his turning of the first wheel of Dharma, so on the Four Noble Truths, and then up to and before he taught the second wheel of Dharma at Vulture's Peak. We roughly, well, we know that up until the age of 29, he remained within the palace walls with his family, and then he left, and then at the age of 35, he achieved full enlightenment. So that's not really disputed. And then likewise, it's quite famously known that for 49 days he remained silent and then taught his first teachings on the Four Noble Truths at Varanasi. Okay, but how long after that was it before he turned the second wheel at Vulture's Peak? So there are many disputes about this and different assertions by great Indian masters. If anyone here has an opinion on that with a source, feel free to bring it up. So it's generally considered more authentic to defer to an Indian source on this matter rather than a Tibetan or Mongolian source as to this timeline, which, in terms of when Tibetan commentaries and Mongolian commentaries are written, it's much after the fact compared to the Indian ones. Mucho se bidola se urbe. Los. Okay, so there are many different opinions on this in the Indic tradition. So after the Buddha achieved full enlightenment, the range of opinions are as such that he taught the second wheel of Dharma 10 years after he became fully enlightened, 11, 12, 13, right? Um, I've read many commentaries, and from what I can see is that there is not much agreement on this point in terms of the exact time. In the Ratnakuta Sutra, which is actually a set of sutras, but sometimes one of those sutras is referred to as the Ratnakuta, it asserts that after turning the first wheel of Dharma of the Four Noble Truths, 16 years passed before he turned the second wheel of Dharma. That being said, we can't say 100% that it was 16 years after he achieved full enlightenment. One really needs to look into this issue and deliberate and decide for oneself. So either way, the Buddha taught 84,000 heaps of Dharma, and the canon or canonized version of that we have in Tibetan is called the Kangyur, and that's comprised of 102 volumes, at least of what was translated into Tibetan. So as to whether it's complete or not, a lot of scholars say that it's not actually complete. Many sutras or tantras were not able to be translated and canonized. So that's the Tibetan canon, and of course there are Korean canons, Chinese, Thai for the Theravadan tradition, and so on and so forth. So I'm sure their contents and amount differ. So within the Kangyur, or the Tibetan Kangyur at least, it comprises the topics of Vinaya, the perfection of wisdom, a general sutra section, and a very large corpus of tantras. So were all of the 84,000 heaps of Dharma that are supposedly canonized the speech of the Buddha? Are they actually Buddha Vachana, spoken from his mouth? Well, not necessarily. So within his sets of teachings, there are teachings that were spoken by another, teachings that were inspired by his blessings, and teachings that were authorized or assented to by the Buddha. 이게 lama pabiyadi kharishawaregana.
디 갑다 다좀 마순디 간다 산이 좀 된디기 갑 디두 슈디가 아니 이게 간라 마 빰네 된디기 로야데 요사 말했어.
Aleolos. So during the Buddha's lifetime, when he gave these teachings to his disciples, which consisted of bodhisattvas, hearers, solitary realizers in their thousands, tens of thousands, and hundreds of thousands, it's probably not the case that they were written down at that time. At that time, the teachings that were given to the disciples who were bodhisattvas, arhats, or at least Arya beings, were recalled by such beings because they had spiritual attainments which are called, for example, the retention of Dharma, in which one does not forget it. So that's adharani. Or they had achieved the meditative stabilization of the stream of Dharma. So essentially, by attaining these levels of realization, even if hundreds of years had passed since they heard that teaching, they were able to recall it perfectly. So this retention in which one does not forget, or this dharani attainment, is by nature a wisdom and a a recollection. So how does one actually achieve such a realization or ability to retain that much information perfectly? Well, one first has to accomplish calm abiding, and then through the condition of special insight assisting that, one achieves this dharani or retention ability as a bodhisattva or an arhat or an arya being in which one does not forget the teachings. We haven't achieved such an ability, and therefore sometimes we can't even remember what we ate for breakfast or what we did the morning of that day. After the Buddha passed into parinirvana, it wasn't possible to write down all of those teachings immediately. They were still existing in the minds of the arhats that had heard them. So it was in dependence upon those beings with such attainments to compile the teachings which were to become canonized, and thus the Sangha convened their first council in which they compiled the teachings. So the motivation for that council at that time would have been to write down the teachings eventually. So the Buddha died at 80 years old, right? Is it 80? So because the disciples who surrounded him, who were arhats and high-level bodhisattvas, had clairvoyance, they knew it was coming. So many of them, unable to bear the thought of the Buddha passing away, decided that they should pass away beforehand, so that because they couldn't bear it. So it's famously said that the 16 elders, right? Geshe said, please drink some water. The 16 elder arhats passed away before the Buddha did. And Shariputra and Moggallana, although they themselves did not pass away before the Buddha did, they also knew it was coming, right? They could see it was coming. And so there are accounts that they could no longer bear to look at the body of the Buddha anymore, knowing what was coming. So, of course, there are also some disagreements as to who the compilers of the teachings actually were. So there are three different assertions that as to who actually was it that compiled these teachings and presented them in their current form, in which you find them in the canon. So the first assertion is that it was actually Manjushri who was the compiler. The second is that it was Vajrapani. And the third is that it was Ananda. So at that time, of course, the Buddha had already passed away when they were convening this first council, and it was the disciple Kashyapa who took on the main responsibility to convene this council and gather all the remaining arhats. So Kashyapa was well known to have attended and heard many of the Buddha's teachings. So he took it upon himself. And because as just said, so many arhats had already died. Of course, many decided to die before the Buddha, and also many just naturally died after. He felt it was pressing that he convened it soon before the others started dying as well, and then the teachings would no longer remain. So he called 499 arhats to the council, but 500 were needed. So they needed that final arhat to make up the number of 500. So there was Ananda left, who was yet to become an arhat. So apparently he had heard and memorized the entire 3 baskets of teachings. He could recite them from memory. But because he mainly was a servant of Buddha Shakyamuni, like preparing food, Geshe thinks, and basically attending to the Buddha, he didn't get much time for meditation in order to become an arhat. So what does this tell us? Well, first of all, it tells us that meditation practice is extremely important. So Ananda had achieved the retention ability to not forget anything he'd heard. But because he didn't get time to meditate, he wasn't able to become an arhat. So that's something for us to think about, right? We say that we're Dhamma practitioners, we pray, we make time for pujas, but if we don't make time for meditation, then there are consequences to that. So the final arhat was needed to make the number of 500, and if Ananda was able to set aside some time to meditate, it was clear that he would become an arhat, and Kashyapa, through his clairvoyance, understood this. So Kashyapa then took it upon himself to convince Ananda to practice to complete the final leg of his spiritual journey. And he could either approach it by being nice to Ananda and encouraging him, or being really harsh on him and forcing him to do it. And through his clairvoyance, he saw that being harsh to Ananda was the better way. So, in this harsh manner, Kashyapa punished Ananda in 8 ways and kicked him out of the assembly. So Kashyapa listed 8 faults that Ananda had committed, and for those reasons banished him from the Sangha. So to list a few of these 8 faults that he criticized him for, the first was that Ananda was the one who was always at the Buddha's side, right? He followed him wherever he went, attending him. And so he knew that the Buddha was going to pass away at that final time. Yet, Kashyapa accused him of ignoring the situation and not really caring, and asking the Buddha to remain instead of passing away into parinirvana. So Kashyapa said, because you did not request that the teacher remain and request that he not pass away, he passed away earlier, and we blame this on you. And so that's reason number 1. Reason number 2 is that when the Blessed One was thirsty, at sometimes you gave him dirty water. Reason number 3 is that when you washed his robes, you then dried them on the grass, which caused certain non-Buddhist gods to grab onto them or something strange. And there's other reasons, but Geshe said I gave you the best ones. So of course, a Sangha being banished from the Sangha, sorry, not a Sangha, Ananda being banished from the Sangha, he was horribly upset. And then his acquaintances asked him, what's wrong? What happened? And he explained, and they said, okay, well, how about you use your time to meditate? And so he did, and then he achieved arhatship. Then Kashyapa, through his clairvoyance, realized that Ananda had achieved arhatship, and so he invited him back into the Sangha to take his seat at the council of 500 arhats. And then when Ananda took his seat, he recited the entire canon of the teachings with his eyes full of tears. So when Ananda recited what he had heard, he said, at the time the Buddha was alive, this is what I have heard. And when he recited the General Sutra section, which has its main topic of meditative stabilization, he received the assent of all the other arhats. That is to say, they supported what he had recited. So thus the General Sutra section of the canon came together through Ananda, and then through Kashyapa. He compiled the section on Abhidharma, which essentially pertains to the topic of training and wisdom. And likewise, he said, "Thus I have heard," and recited the teachings. And having done so, the 500 arhats at the council assented, right? Because for it to be accepted, it required the assent of all of them. Then after that, the monk Upali recited all the topics related to ethical discipline, so the Vinaya, saying, "Thus I have heard," and he likewise received the assent of the other arhats at the council. And thus, later in the canon, it became well known that it had three main baskets, right? The basket of sutras, of Abhidharma, and of Vinaya. So, of course, Kashyapa, having that retention ability, could have compiled all of the teachings himself if he wanted to. But in order to inspire faith for future disciples, he decided to convene a council of 500 arhats to lend authority to the canonized teachings. So our current topic of discussion within the canon is the Heart Sutra, which falls within the basket of Abhidharma or manifest knowledge because it mainly talks about wisdom. The Heart Sutra is famously recognized throughout many traditions in Asian countries as the word of the Buddha, right? The authentic word of the Buddha. And it exists in many languages, right? In Sanskrit, Tibetan, Chinese, Korean, and so on and so forth. It is well known that it was translated very early on from Indic sources into Chinese. The main authoritative commentaries in our tradition, within our canon, are the seven authentic Indian commentaries. And on top of that, there are, by my count, at least 15 or 16 authentic Tibetan commentaries, probably more than that even. But mainly we defer to these 7 authentic Indian commentaries. So Geshe-la asked me to give you the names of these 7 authentic Indian commentaries. I have those here. I prepared them when we were deliberating which commentary to use for these sessions. In the end, we decided they were too difficult. We're not going to use any of them. But Geshe-la wants me to read it out for your imprints anyway. So the title of all of these commentaries are very similar. They're essentially titled The Commentary on the Heart Sutra. So I'm not going to read out the names of the commentaries, but I'll just read out the names of the authors. And in any canon of the Kangyur, or not the Kangyur, this is a Tengyur section that you look at. These are all side by side, so they're grouped together in the Tengyur. So Vimalamitra is one of the Indic authors, Gyanamitra, Vajrapani, which Geshe-la said is a Nepali author, Prashastarasena, Kamalashila, who you would have heard of, Atisha Dipamkara, Srijana, which you know all know of Atisha, and another figure called Sri Mahajana. Oh, that's okay. So Geshe-la is providing some ancillary information to these. So 3 out of these 7 commentaries were actually written within Tibet, wherein the master came to Tibet, gave the teaching, and that teaching was translated into Tibetan and set down and canonized. So that's Atisha's commentary. Atisha came to Tibet, and Geshe-la said, I believe it's relating to Atisha at Samye. He taught this commentary. It was translated into Tibetan. Geshe-la thinks also Vimalamitra's commentary was actually composed within Tibet, and I asked what the third was. He said he's not 100% sure, but so it is said that 3 of those were composed within Tibet itself. Some scholars say that actually the Perfection of Wisdom Sutra, called the Heart Sutra, is a tantric text, and you do find it in the Dharani section of the canon as well, right? It exists in the General Sutra section and the Dharani section in certain versions of the Kangyur. So as for these seven main commentators, Vajrapani, who we said was a Nepali master, he
하나도지.
comments upon lots of Vajrapani,
어,
Chanadoji. He comments on it as if it were a tantric text. And of course, within the Heart Sutra, it does present a Dharani mantra, doesn't it? And for that reason, it gets put in that section as well. So within the Gelug tradition, Kyedru Rinpoche states that, well, actually, the Heart Sutra is only a sutra, like a sutric teaching. It has no relevance to Tantra. And he states this in his general presentation on the classes of Tantra. With respect to how we're going to approach this topic of the Heart Sutra, there is a commentary by Jamyang Gawe Lodro, which has been translated into English and is available. I'm sure somebody here can give you the file. It's been translated by Thupten Jinpa. So it's very, very concise, sometimes a bit too concise. And Geshe said he's going to be following that, although I thought he changed his mind and was going to take from Denda Laramba's commentary, but no, he's
네.
just reading that on the side. So Jamyang Gaya Lodro is actually an earlier historical figure compared to Dendal Haramba. Dendal Haramba, probably born in the 18th century. Jamyang Gaya Lodro is much earlier than that. I don't have his dates here, but I think he's even a couple hundred or 300 years before Dendal Haramba. So usually the earlier commentators are preferred. So at the start of Jamyang Lodro's text, he says, I respectfully pay homage to the lotus feet of the most holy Manjushri. So when a commentator authors a text, they normally author a verse of homage or words of homage in order to prevent obstacles that arise on the path of their virtuous pursuit. So one will often pay homage to one's own personal yidam. The text then follows with, having bowed to the conqueror who taught that there are not two but only one path, trodden by all the Buddhas and their children, I shall elucidate here briefly the words of the heart of wisdom, which is the most cherished treasury of all his teachings. So I wasn't able to follow Geshe-la's word by word commentary on the Tibetan right now because I was actually searching for the Tibetan text. But fortunately for us, the English is straightforward compared to the Tibetan. So Jamyang Gaya Lodro is then presenting the Heart Sutra by way of four sections: the meaning of its title, the homage by the translator, the subject matter of the main text, and the conclusion. So the first, the meaning of its title, refers to the start of the sutra, which says in the Indian language, etc. The understanding of which is easy, so we understand that it was first presented in an Indic language. This So when the Tibetans translated the word Bhagawat, here we have the feminine version, Bhagawati, into Tibetan. They didn't do so literally. They basically translated it into essentially a different word with different components. So in Tibetan, it's Jomdinde. So Jom means to destroy and refers to the destruction of all afflictions. Den means possessed of, meaning possessed of all qualities. And De means past beyond. So the Tibetan word for a Bhagavat or the Blessed One is actually packed with meaning. Pragya means wisdom, prajna, however you want to pronounce it. Here it's a specific type of wisdom that it's referring to, so a special insight that distinguishes the all phenomena, and the particular special insight that can act as the direct antidote to the subtle obscurations to knowledge that prevent us from attaining omniscience.
아디네기 빠랍니다. 8월 침바.
So then paramita, or perfection. So literally it means having gone to the far shore. So the far shore is Buddhahood, meaning that the close shore is samsara. So through the union of emptiness and bodhicitta, a person will go to the far shore. So for example, if you are on the banks of a raging river and you need to cross to the other side, you need a method in which to cross the river. So whether that be a boat or whatever, that's analogous to the method that we require to reach the far shore of Buddhahood. So the realization of wisdom would be that principal method, which is assisted by compassion and bodhicitta. So here it gets interesting because the Sanskrit doesn't really reflect the Tibetan and thus the Tibetan commentaries. But back to the word Bhagavati for a second. The Tibetans translated that into a feminine version of their word for Bhagavat. So Jomdin Dema, right? 4 syllables. Much more complicated than the word Bhagavati. But they understand Bhagavati essentially to be the wisdom realizing emptiness. And in the Tibetan language, Ma, which is the final syllable of their translation, means mother, right? This is how they're interpreting the word. And as I've explained earlier, mother is how we refer to wisdom within our tradition, right? The mother, the wisdoms act as a mother in someone's lineage, and minds like bodhicitta act as a father. So I mean that's sort of hard to resolve in translation because the Tibetan is quite different to the Sanskrit. As for Hridaya, the final Sanskrit word in the title, there are multiple explanations as to what it means in this context. So some scholars have said that it is an essence or a heart, meaning it is the supreme essence of a wisdom realizing profound emptiness, right? The supreme or essential one among them. Others say that it simply means concise, right? The Heart Sutra is a short, concise version of all of the Buddha's explanations of the perfection of wisdom, and therefore heart simply means a concise version. So Geshe told me not to translate the next thing he said because I think he's speaking to his Tibetan audience here, but I mean, why not? So with respect to the word Jomdin De Ma, the source for that word or syllable ma at the end, referring to wisdom, is the Rice Seedling Sutra, in which it says the mother is wisdom, the father is method. Anyway, if we move on, a perfection of wisdom can be categorized as either that which is by nature a perfection of wisdom, a path of the perfection of wisdom, a result of the perfection of wisdom, or a treatise of the perfection of wisdom. So in 4 ways. So that which is by nature perfection of wisdom is emptiness. A treatise that is a perfection of wisdom in this context is the Heart Sutra itself. A result of the perfection of wisdom is the victorious state of omniscience that one achieves in dependence upon listening and contemplating the Heart Sutra. And the perfection of wisdom, which is a path, is referring to those paths that the Heart Sutra actually teaches, those meditative stabilizations, special insights. So why is the name of the text stated at the start of this sutra? Well, some might actually doubt where this sutra should be placed within the canon or in which of the 3 baskets it belongs. So from the title itself, which is it contains the words perfection of wisdom, we know that it belongs in the basket of Abhidharma. The homage, which is also at the start of the sutra after its name, is a regular feature within the sutras that the translators would add at the beginning in order to prevent obstacles to their composition. So next, Jamyang Lodro presents his sections of the prologue indicating the origination of the sutra and the subject matter of the actual sutra. So first we start with the setting of the scene, or the nidana. There are two types of settings you find in sutras, a common one and an uncommon one, or a unique one. So all sutras will have a general or common nidana at their beginning, essentially saying, here we are, this is what we're going to be talking about. So first is the common prologue, or setting of the scene. And Jamyang Lodro says, first refers to the coming together of the four perfect factors, so the four excellences. Sometimes here in the Heart Sutra commentaries, they present five, but here it's four. So we have the excellent time, which is indicated by the words, thus have I once heard, right? Then the blessed one indicates the perfect factor of teacher, or the excellent teacher. In Rajagriha at Vulture's Peak indicates the excellent place, along with a great community of monks up to the bodhisattvas, indicates the excellent factor of retinue. These are easy to understand, he says. So let's unpack this a little bit. So it starts with, thus have I heard. So when one compiles this teaching, right, in order to enter it into the canon, one needs to first start with this statement. It is said that the one who compiled this sutra was actually Manjushri. There are different assertions, but most scholars think that it was Manjushri. And so him being the compiler of this teaching, right, the one who is reciting it, added at the start, as was necessary, thus have I heard. And he says, I heard this, to indicate that he's not authoring it, but he heard it from the authoritative, authentic source, which is the Buddha. And he says, thus have I heard at one time. He adds in this qualification at one time to indicate that this teaching was only given once and not more, which shows that it is very rare, right? It shows the preciousness of the teachings. So Geshe is reading multiple commentaries. What he just explained was from a commentator called Trakpa Sherab. Now he's going to move on to Dendal Tharampa's commentary regarding the prologue, or the setting of the scene. And Dendal Tharampa says, with respect to the common prologue, which pertains to the words, thus did I hear at one time, to the great assembly of bodhisattvas, the purpose of this is to have the listeners understand that the compiler listened without adding anything or subtracting anything, so that they could pay careful attention to him. Right? So that's the purpose of saying that line. So then he follows with saying that the master Haribhadra says that the words at one time means that the blessings of the Buddha, by the blessings of the Buddha, all the words of the sutra were heard by Ananda in one instant. So that contradicts Geshe-la's previous commentary that he read that says that the compiler was Manjushri. So here Haribhadra, the famous commenter on Maitreya's ornament, he says it was Ananda who compiled this teaching. Los. Then Daltaramba continues by saying, and another scholar, Bhava Viveka, asserts that because the perfection of wisdom sutras are not within the sphere of the Shravakas, right? The Shravakas are unable to hear and understand them. Their compiler is therefore Vajrapani, right? So Vajrapani compiled this Heart Sutra, not Ananda, not Manjushri. So as you can see, the Heart Sutra itself is quite a short text, but the commentators can really approach it in a very, very vast manner, and they often end up contradicting each other on the superficial points, like who was the compiler, but that's not fundamental to the understanding of the text, is it, right? Fundamentally, these great commentators aren't contradicting each other on the main meaning, which is the most important. So Geshe said, I've spent a lot of time introducing this text because although in Eastern Buddhist traditions we might not pay much attention to history and context, in the West, Westerners, as you know, are very much interested in contextualizing treatises and texts, and therefore I've gone into a bit more detail this time. And actually, whatever treatise you studied, it's actually very important to contextualize it, wouldn't you agree? So it seems somebody has a question. If you have one, please ask.
Okay, we will have Butterfly. Please ask your question and you can unmute yourself. Okay, Cindy, you don't. You can ask, ma.
Okay. Okay, I want to ask, just now Geshe-la said in the beginning, right, the introduction, when the Buddha passed away, the Arahat actually died. They just cannot bear. So my question is, so they are Arahat, right? They realize emptiness. So I thought they're supposed to have no defilements, they have purified everything. So why they still like, I don't know, attached?
Upset. Yeah, why are they upset?
Why are they still upset, you know? So this
Yeah.
is my
It's a very good question. So we need to distinguish between different types of arhats. So if you're a Mahayana arhat, the final destination within the Mahayana is Buddhahood, right? So a Mahayana arhat is a Buddha. These disciples who we've said became upset at the thought of the Buddha dying are likely the Hinayana, Hira, and solitary realizer arhats. So that kind of arhat has abandoned the sufferings of samsara, but they have not completed their own aims and they have not accomplished the aims of others, right? They still have yet to abandon the obscurations to knowledge, right? Those obscurations which prevent perfect Buddhahood. So Geshe says a good question. I don't know, Geshe is saying, I don't know if I'm answering it exactly, but I would assume it's due to that reason, right? That they still have abandonments left, that they went through these experiences.